Couple more. All right. We're looking good. Well, welcome everybody to this excellent Michael's class of Knitting 101. We appreciate you being here. Before we get started with our project today, we just have a few items to go over to ensure everyone can have the best class experience possible. Firstly, the class is being recorded and will be uploaded to the Michaels Store YouTube channel in about 24 hours, and then it'll appear on the michaels.com/classes webpage the next day. Consider subscribing to our YouTube channel so you never miss out on our class recordings, or if you need to go back after today's class. And if you are making along with the instructor today, don't forget to tag Michaels with our hashtag Make It With Michaels and hashtag Michaels Classes when sharing pictures of your work on social media. We love to see it. During class, you can interact with the instructor and moderators using the Zoom chat function. If you don't want to see the chat during the class, it's perfectly fine, of course. You can turn it off within your Zoom settings. So here's how you do that. If you're on a tablet or mobile device, you can do that by clicking the 3 dots with the word more under them, and then click the chat option and click the bell-shaped button in the corner of your screen. That should turn it off for you, get it out of your screen. If you're on a computer, you can stop the chat from popping up on your screen by clicking on the chat icon on the bottom of your screen to make the chat window appear on the right side, and then clicking the drop-down arrow at the top of that section and choosing pop out. You can minimize, drag that window, close it, whatever it is that you'd like to do from there. We also want to make sure that you're using speaker view when you're watching. We've spotlighted our terrific instructor here as well, so you'll always be watching the instructor's point of view. If you want to see everyone in the class, you could switch over to gallery view if you'd like. We do have automatic closed captioning enabled for this meeting. You can also turn on those settings in the 3 dots more section that I mentioned with the chat function, and then clicking on the meeting settings with the gear icon. And then lastly, of course, if you have any technical issues, anything you might need help with, feel free to message me directly in the chat and I can assist you with anything to the best of my ability, of course. But we appreciate it. We thank you all for being here. We're going to go ahead and turn it over to Marley and our Yanspirations team to get us started.
Whoop, whoop. I was like, all right, can you hear me? All right, good. Go ahead, Lillian.
Thanks, Marley. Hey, everyone. Welcome back to another live community classroom with Michaels. Today we have Marley here from the Marley Bird with us ready for another exciting class. Today we'll be learning how to knit. My name is Lillian from Yanspirations and I'll be helping with any questions you might have during today's class. Feel free to ask questions in the chat here and we'll be sure that Marley answers them. And while we're getting started, feel free to let us know where you're watching from. Thanks. Back to you, Marley.
Awesome. Well, hello, everybody. How many of you have tried to knit before in the past? Give me a show of hands. Whoop, so many of you. Fantastic. Well, that will help you out immensely as we go through this process and work together. Couple rules. I want to make sure that you follow along with me as we go through this process. Remember that you are learning something completely new. Even if you've tried to do this before, it might not have that muscle memory yet. So you are going to give yourself a little bit of grace today as we're working through all of these stitches, the cast on and the bind off and so on and so forth. It might not come easily at the start, but if you are persistent and practice and are just like, I'm going to get this, you will get this eventually. But I want you to be patient with yourself. I know that as adults, it's a little bit harder. We're more of a, hey, I want to learn. I want to get this. I want to get moving along. And it's hard to be patient, but we're just going to be like, hey, at the end of the day, it sticks and string. It's gonna be fine, and we're gonna be fine. All right. Can everybody agree to that? Yep. Awesome. I see you guys. Fantastic. Okay. So as they said, my name is Marley Bird. I am a knitter and a crocheter, which means I'm bi-crafty. I love to do both of the crafts all the time, and I love to teach people how to knit and crochet, and I love to see that aha moment. As I said, it's one of those things you have to build muscle memory up in your hands, and once you do that, you'll be smooth sailing with knitting or crocheting. Today, we're going learn how to cast on stitches, and that's how you put on the stitches on your needle so you can actually start creating fabric. We're going to learn to knit those stitches. We're going to fix some common mistakes that beginners make, which is a huge thing to learn because that's one of those things that some teachers forget to teach you. So then when they leave you and you make the mistake, you're kind of like, what do I do now? You know, so we're going to learn a couple of common mistakes and how to fix them. And we're going to learn to bind off. So did you notice we didn't say purling in there? Purling is something that I personally, I wait to show people in like a knitting 201 sort of class. So with learning how to just knit and all those other things I mentioned, there are so many projects out there you can create. So that will get us started. All right. As far as supplies, hopefully you have some needles with you, whether they're straight needles or circulars, it doesn't matter to me, and some yarn. That's we need to have on hand. Now, as they mentioned, this class is getting recorded, which means in order for me to make sure that I get all of that in this 1 hour time frame, I'm going to be moving along, not at a fast pace, but at a regular pace. If for some reason you feel like you're getting left behind because you're not getting one section, I want you to be patient, set your knitting down, and just watch the video at that time, and then go back and re-watch the video later on and follow along again. I will re-show things several different times, and with the videos, you can always rewind. So I don't want you to think that all is lost if you don't get like at the very beginning how to cast on. That's not it. It just could be that you need to do it a little bit more later on. Everybody got that? All right, so here we go. I'm going to go down to my hands here. And I am using some basic size 8 knitting needles. And I just pulled out my straight needles right now. I will give you guys a tip if you've never picked up knitting needles before. The ones that are bamboo or wood or plastic tend to grab your yarn a little bit more than metal ones. So if you find that as you're knitting, your stitches are falling off too quickly or they're just going too fast, it could be that you would like to use some wood ones. Give those a try. It might make things easier. I'm also using a bigger worsted weight yarn here just to help you better see the stitches, but hopefully you have some worsted weight yarn with you and you're giving that a whirl, and we're going to get started with that. Okay, as I said, we're going to start with a cast on, and a cast on sounds, I mean, it's just what it is. We're going to put stitches on our needle so that way we can begin to build fabric on top of them, okay? So when I teach beginners, I like to teach what's called the knitted cast on because it's the perfect transition from learning to cast on and then working into the knit stitch. You're really reiterating that knit muscle memory. But we have to begin with a slip knot. Now, if you know how to make a slip knot, go ahead and make one. But if you don't, here's how it is. And you'll get this. This is not that difficult. Put the tail of your yarn in the palm of your hand. Take your working yarn, wrap it around your forefinger and your middle finger. And when you come back up, cross it over. Now rotate your hand. And what we're going to do, we're going to go underneath this front loop, grab that back loop, and pull it off of our fingers. And you get a slip knot. I'm going to show you one more time. We have the tail in the palm of our hands. I'm going to take the working yarn, wrap it around my forefinger and my middle finger. And when I come back up, I cross over. I rotate my hand, and I keep tension on the working yarn right there, and I keep tension on the tail down there. So that way I can go underneath this loop, grab the back one, and then pull those off of my fingers. And I'm still holding the tail, I'm still holding the working yarn, and when I pull those, it makes a knot right there with this big loop. And if I separate these tails, it tightens up that loop. You see that? Okay. Once you get that slip knot, you're going to place it directly onto one of your needles and then place that needle in your left hand. Now I'm going to say right here, some of you might be like, well, I'm right-handed or I'm left-handed. Knitting is wonderfully ambidextrous, and you can knit in the way I'm showing you that's right-handed because we're going to use both of our hands when we knit. So it doesn't matter if you're left-handed or right-handed, this is what we're going to do, okay? So I've placed the needle in my left hand. Here's my slip knot. I do not want to make my slip knot like super tight onto my needle where I can't even like move it, right? I want it to be just nice and relaxed where it can move, but it's not so big that it's like that it's just going to flop off. You know what I mean? So you want to make sure it's that comfortable medium right there. All right. When we hold our needle, I'm going to grasp a needle just like if I were to hold a knife, and I'm going to keep my fingers near the tip of my needle. Okay. I'm also, and this is what I do, I tend to control my stitches that are here, either with my forefinger or my middle finger, depending on how I'm knitting. I just want to control these stitches so they don't fall off until I want them to. Okay. I don't get to control many things in life. So this is where I take the opportunity to control something. All right, y'all. So we have this loop on here, and what we ultimately want to do, get that tail out of the way, is we want to pull this string through this loop and put another loop on our needle. Like that's our ultimate goal here, okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to take our other needle, our right hand needle. I'm going to go from left to right. So I'm going to go from the left side through that loop just right to the back. Can you see how it looks like it's to the back? I'll do that one more time. So here's my loop on my needle. I'm going to go from left to right, and I'm just going right through the loop. Now I'm going to take this yarn, and I'm not going to stress too much here at the start on how to hold the yarn. Okay. At some point, you're going to hold the yarn in a way that's comfortable to you. You want to keep some tension on this yarn. It helps. But right now, I'm not going to stress too much about it because we got some other things we're going to worry about until we get comfortable with that. You grab your yarn, and we're going to go around that needle that we put into the loop. We're going to go around it the long way. All right. I don't want you to go around it like this. Don't go over top of it. You're going to go underneath it and around the long way. Hold the yarn and your right hand needle in the same hand, kind of like to give yourself some tension. Now here's our ultimate goal here. Now that yarn that I just wrapped around my right hand needle, it's right there. We want to pull that through this loop. So just imagine for me for a minute. I'm going to make this really large. I'm going to put my finger in here. Pretend my finger is the knitting needle that I just stuck in there. And then we took this yarn and we wrapped it around that finger, right? So this is essentially what you just did. And what I want to do now is I want to take this yarn and I want to pull it through here. So essentially I'm going to take it and just kind of go like that, right? Can you see that? It's like I'm just going like this. Everybody understand? So when I do that with the actual knitting needle, it's the same thing. It's just on a smaller scale. I'm going in, I'm going around, and then I'm going to pull that loop through. So you kind of hold the right hand needle close to the left hand needle. And if you keep tension on the yarn that you use to wrap, you can see I just kind of scrape it right underneath and pull it through. All right. Once I do that, here's the next step. All right. We're going to extend the loop we just pulled through. So I'm extending that loop that I just pulled through. And then with my left hand needle, this is where I want to put this loop on this needle, but I do not want to just put it on just like this. Okay. I don't just want to be like, okay, now it's on there. I want to take my left hand needle and I want to swivel underneath that loop and scoop it up. And now it's on my left hand needle. And then we do it all over again. Okay, you guys ready? We're going to go into this new one. We're going to go in, around, out, extend, swivel, and scoop. 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 All right, I want you guys to keep doing that. Those of you who've gotten it, keep going. Get yourself some stitches on here. For everybody else, I'm going to take these off and I'm going to do that all one more time just so we can start from the very beginning, just so you can see it, okay? So we're going to start with the slip knot. I have the tail in the palm of my hand. I have the working yarn. I'm going to wrap it around my forefinger and middle finger. And when I come back up, I'm going to cross over. By doing this crossover, what it does is when I rotate my hand, it allows this yarn to go behind the wrap I just created. So now when I go underneath this front loop, grab the back loop and pull it off, I have a nice little slip knot. I place that slip knot on my knitting needle, tighten it up a little bit, place the knitting needle in my left hand, and now I'm going to do what's called the knitted cast on. So this simulates a knit stitch. Here's the stitch on my left hand needle. So I go from left to right, like I'm just going to stick the needle essentially through that loop. So I'm sticking my needle through that loop. At this point, I'm grasping. Can you see how I'm grasping both needles with one hand and I'm grabbing this yarn? My working yarn, this is the yarn that's attached to my ball of yarn. I'm going a long way around my right hand needle so that I'm wrapping my right hand needle. So that way I can pull that wrap through the loop. Then I extend this one, swivel and scoop that up and put it on my left hand needle. So now I have 2 stitches. So if I want more, let's say I want to get to 15, I would go into the next one. So the one I just created. So I go in, around, out, extend, swivel and scoop. 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 I'm going to get some stitches on here to go along with all of you. I can see those of you who are working along in the gallery. It looks like you're doing really well. I know this seems funny, you guys. Remember, our rule number 1 was to be patient with yourself. Your eyes are looking at me and you're like, it looks so easy. And your eyes and brain are telling your hands to do exactly what I'm doing. And it might feel like you're all thumbs. You're like, I just don't understand. Dude, you're not the only one. Look around the gallery. There are other people who feel just like you. And that's perfectly normal. If it makes all of you guys feel any better, when I first learned to knit, I actually threw my knitting across the room because I got so frustrated. So, and that's true story, you guys. So when I tell you it's just sticks and string, it really is. And it's all about muscle memory. I mean, I've been doing this now, gosh, 25 years or something like that. So of course mine, it looks really easy, but yours will get there. I promise you. All right, so I don't care how many you have on there. Hopefully you have at least 10, I guess is what I'm going to say. You have 10 stitches on there, okay? So the cool thing here, guys, what we've done right here, as I said, we have cast on stitches. So we've created what would be the bottom of our fabric. If you're a crocheter, this would be like you just chained enough so that you can start working into chains, okay? We now are going to go into each of these stitches along the way and do exactly what we just did, only instead of swivel and scooping to put the stitch on here, we're going to allow the new stitch we create jump over here to our right hand needle and let the stitch we went into come off of our left hand needle. So we're going to start knitting. All right, you guys are almost there. You ready? Here we go. You're going to see why I use this cast on to transition into knitting, because it just gets so much easier because we've already done what we're going to do. We're going to go into this stitch just like we did before. We're going to go around our needle just like we did before. We're going to come out our stitch just like we did before. And here's where things are different. Are you ready? When you come out this stitch, first off, I want to make sure that your right hand needle, don't keep that stitch right down here at the tip. Okay, don't keep it down here at the tip. Push your right hand needle up a little bit so this new stitch is now on the barrel of your needle. Once it's there, this stitch right there that we went into on the left hand needle, we're going to push it off. Boop, it jumped off the porch. So now you have work that looks like this. All right, here's your number one mistake that beginner knitters make. You guys ready? Everybody pay attention. Once you do this, do not separate your needles out like this. Don't separate them like this thinking you're going to tighten it up, okay? You want your needles sort of in this sort of cross position the whole way, because as the stitches transfer over here to this right hand needle from the left hand needle, you want it to look as if the needles were straight like this, that it looks like it's just in a straight row. You don't want to look like there's like a big gap. So you just transfer it over and just let it be comfortable there. Now, we've been worrying about these stitches possibly falling off, but now we have this one we don't want to fall off. So you want to make sure you don't let this fall off. So this is where I tend to hold my thumb there so that it doesn't go anywhere, because as I'm knitting, you'll notice I tend to move. I use these 3 fingers to really grasp my knitting needle and move it a lot. And so what we're going to do is we have this one stitch here. We're now going to go into the next stitch on our left hand needle, just like before. So I'm going to go from left to right and go into it. I'm going to go around the needle just like before. I'm going to come out that stitch just like before. Again, notice I always shove my needle up so that the stitch gets down here. And I'm going to let that one fall off. Go to the next. So in, around, out, off. In, around, out, off. In, around, out, off. In, around, out, off. You guys see that? In, around, out, off. In, around, out, off. I'm going to do this all the way down until I have knit into each one of my stitches. One thing you will notice is I'm keeping the yarn to the back of my needles. It's just naturally right there. You do not want the yarn in front of your needles because that's when you are going to purl, and we are not purling, we are actually knitting. When it's done, your work could look kind of twisted up and stuff, right? This is where I take the opportunity, and it's still in my right hand. I just straighten up my knitting. And as I'm knitting, I want my cast on row and all my subsequent rows to flow down from my knitting needles. I don't ever want to knit with everything facing up. I want it to flow down from my needles. Okay. All right, so I'm going to pause. I'm going to see where everybody is. You guys are doing great. I see a lot of concentration. A couple of you are just sitting back and enjoying the show right now. That's fine. All right, so it's in my right hand. Now my left hand needle is empty. And just like if this were a crochet project where you would turn your work, our turn in knitting is by taking our right hand needle and placing it into our left hand, and then putting our spare needle into our right hand. And then we repeat the process. Okay. Can you see this? So here's something I do want to point out as you turn your work. And this is something that seems like it's a little confusing. So I'm going to try and use a visual here to help out. When you knit, I'm going to put this back over here. When you knit stitches, you create a fabric that looks like a V. Okay. It looks like, let me see if I can use this. You see how these look like they're V's along the fabric right here. And on the back side of these V's, you'll see that there are bumps, okay? That's because if you're looking at the knit side of a fabric, on the opposite side, those are going to be purls. Just like if we think of the knit side as heads, I know that looking at a quarter, if I'm looking at heads over here and I turn my quarter over, I'm going to be looking at purls or tails over here. Does that make sense? So when you are knitting a stitch, when we're knitting these stitches, we've knit all these stitches, so they represent like they're a head on our quarter. So when I put my needle in my left hand, and all of a sudden I'm seeing these bumps, and you're like, Marley, why am I seeing bumps? Because I just knit, but now these are purl bumps. You're seeing those purl bumps because look at my quarter. I'm on the back side of a knit stitch, which means I'm going to see purls because it's just like it's the tails of a quarter. Does that help you guys? The reason I want to point that out is because as I get ready to say here, that when we're working this row, we want to make sure that we are not working into these purl bumps. I want you to understand why you are seeing purl bumps, even though you just knit, okay? So the first thing we're going to do as you put your work in your other hand, let me get some yarn here going. You're going to make sure that your yarn is behind your needle, okay? Because when you knit, your yarn is back here. When you eventually purl, your yarn is in front of your needle, but when we knit, our yarn is behind our needle. So the first thing you want to do is make sure your yarn is behind the needle. Here is the second big thing that beginner knitters will do as far as making mistakes, okay? You guys ready? This is the second big one. This last stitch here sometimes tends to be a little bit loose. And as knitters, we're like, oh, I want to tighten that up. So what you do is you take your yarn and you pull it up to bring your yarn to the back, because you're like, Marley told me I had to have my yarn in the back. Oh, look, that makes that stitch nice and tight. Everything's looking good now. But really what you've done here is, see how it looks like you have two stitches now? What you really did was you pulled the stitch from the row below up so much that the two legs of that stitch now look like it's two stitches on your needle. So then beginner knitters will accidentally knit one into there and one into there, and all of a sudden they've increased their stitches. So as we're working this fabric, first off, don't ever pull your yarn up top like this to try and tighten up anything, okay? You want to make sure everything is nice and flowing down. And yeah, that is a little bit loose there, but it's okay. I'm going to show you how you can tighten up an edge here. But we know that all of these stitches have purls here because we just talked about our quarter and how the back side of our knits and purls, you know what I mean? So we know that we should see a purl bump right there. So the first clue when we pull this up is, oh, there's no purl. Where'd my purl bump go? Well, your purl bump is actually like way up here. You've just pulled it way the heck up there. You know, you just gave it a nice little facelift, but we don't want that. So we want to make sure that we see that little purl bump right there. And the second thing here is when we go to knit into this stitch, you want to make sure you don't knit into the purl bump on accident. You want to go into the stitch that is on your needle. Okay. So this is going to be just like we did before. All the same here. Here are our stitches. I'm going to pull my tail out of the way, take my right hand needle. I'm going to go from left to right, going into the stitch that's on my left hand needle. Go around, out, and off. In, around, out, off. In, around, out, off. In, around, out, off. We're going to do this all the way down the row. You guys are doing great. I see a lot of patience out here. I know some of you are probably struggling a little bit, and I'm telling you, it's okay. It's okay if your hands are shaking. It's okay if the stitches feel like they're falling off your needles. It's okay if you feel like it's the first time you've ever been on a bike. It's okay. That is perfectly normal. That's perfectly natural, and that feeling will go away as you do more and more practice, and you create that neural pathway from your hands to your brain to your eyes to do this knit stitch. I promise you it gets easier, you guys. I promise you. All right, notice I got to the end of the row, and I always just straighten mine out just to make sure it looks nice and neat. That looks good. And I put my work into my left hand and I start again. And you'll see I'm looking at those purl bumps, which is what I want. Now we're going to do this for a couple more rows. And while I'm doing that, I'm going to ask Lillian to pop in here and see if there are any questions you guys have. And I'm just going to keep on knitting here and answer your questions.
Thanks, Marley. We do have a question here from Susan. She asks, does it matter what direction you're wrapping around?
Yes, it does. So as you're coming in, you want to make sure you're wrapping around your needle just like this. You don't want to wrap it over top and back down. The reason is if you wrap it this way, it sits the stitch on your needle incorrectly. I want you to see here. I don't know if you can, I'm going to turn it here so you can just kind of pop here and see. If I wrap it the other way, can you see here how the back leg looks like it's slightly ahead of the front leg? All right. So it looks like the back leg is ahead of the front leg. If you wrap it correctly, I'm just going to slip that over so you can see the front leg looks like it's ahead of the back leg. It's like the front leg is saying, knit me, knit me. So if you did things like this, where the back leg is ahead, and you went to knit this front leg, it would make it difficult to knit and you would twist stitches. So in order to make sure your stitches do not get twist in them, you want to make sure you wrap your right hand needle correctly. I'm sorry, I put my yarn in the other hand. You want to wrap your right hand needle, go in and go underneath and around, and then come out and off. In, the long way around, out and off. And the whole reason you do it this way is so that way we can have those stitches sitting on the needle in such a manner where all of the other instructions can be completed just as they're written. We don't have to make any sort of alterations. As you become more and more advanced, you'll understand the whole concept of the way a stitch is mounted on your needle and different ways to work stitches like that, or different types of knitting. That is like there's a type of knitting called combination knitting, where they naturally have stitches that are seated on the needle in a different manner, but they correct it on the next row. There's lots of different things out there, but here at the beginning, I just want to make sure we're starting just like this. Anything else?
Yeah, we have a question here. Karina asks, how do you keep the tension of the yarn while knitting?
All right. So tension is one of those things that sort of comes with time. You find a way that holding the yarn is convenient for you, but I will show you how I hold my yarn. So truth be told, I actually knit with I keep the yarn in my left hand, like that's my preferred. But when I'm holding the yarn in my right hand, I like to twist it around my pinky, and I sort of go like this. It's like I wind it through my fingers and twist it around my pinky. Sometimes, yeah, I always twist around my pinky. I go like, now I'm thinking because I can't think about it. I go like this. And so when I do that and I grasp the needle, like I still have some tension there. Now I have friends who just tension it like this. I have friends who tension it all up on their finger like this. You have to find a way that works for you. Honestly, it's one of those things that as the muscle memory comes, you'll all of a sudden realize that you're holding your yarn the same way every time. You're gonna have to find a way that's comfortable for you. Something else I do want to point out, this is another beginner mistake a lot of people will do, is beginners tend to knit very tight. And what happens is they'll knit, watch this, they'll knit and sort of in the same manner of pulling up the yarn down here and creating the double stitch, is they'll take the yarn, they'll knit, and then they pull up like this. They pull up just like this. And I want you to see what that does. Watch this. I'm going to unknit this one. So watch the whole process. So I'm going to knit, I'm going in, I'm going around, I'm coming out. So this stitch that's coming off, that top of that stitch becomes that purl bump. This thing right here, that stitch becomes the stitch on my needle, right? So now the stitch on my needle, it looks like it's a circle, right? It's a circle around my needle. The stitch that came off, it's now this bump right there, and everything's good if I keep my yarn nice and relaxed down here. But watch what happens to the size of the stitch on my needle when I try and tighten up my work by pulling up my yarn. Okay, watch. I pull up my yarn to tighten it up. That's no longer a circle. That's like just a line, right? And the purl bump that was down there is now way the heck up here. So all of a sudden your knitting is super duper tight. So you don't want to tighten your stitches in that manner. You really want your stitches to be a comfortable circumference around your needle. So as you're knitting, one thing that I find is, I don't know if you can tell, like I'm resting my forefinger here. I rest it sort of behind my needle. Like it's pretty straight across from here. It's not up here. Let's see, it's not like up here, it's back here. Can you guys tell the difference? Okay. So when you're knitting, I guess the biggest thing here is don't be like, oh, I got to tighten this up. Don't do that. Don't be that person. It'll be too tight for you. It'll be very difficult to get into stitches, and it's just not going to be an enjoyable thing. I mean, trust me, I know. I used to do that. So I get it. Okay. I'm going to turn my work here. All right. So that was 3 different tips, right? So I'm going to show you another one here. You ready? So some of you are like, okay, Marley, if I don't pull my yarn up right here at the beginning to tighten that up, how do I make sure like my first stitches here are a little bit more snug, that they're not so loosey-goosey and ugly? Well, I'm going to show you the wiggle and tug. All right, guys. So here's what you're going to do. You're going to go into the stitch. You're going to wrap your yarn just like you do. You're going to come out the stitch just like you do. And you're going to come off the stitch just like you do. But here's the difference. The stitch you just had jump off and the stitch you just created are essentially connected, right? Because we just knit that stitch and we just knit this one. Whereas like down here, when we go to knit this, it has to go through like that one and that one before the new one. Does that make sense? So my point here is, as I tug on my working yarn and I wiggle my needle, not only does it snug up the stitch on my needle, it snugs up the stitch underneath. So watch, I'm going to tug my yarn and I'm wiggling my needle to tighten up the stitch beneath. And so now that one's a little bit more snug. This one here it's still right around my needle. I'm not tightening it up like this. I just do a little wiggle and tug and it tightens up the stitch below. It makes this stitch nice and neat and it makes my edge beautiful. So if your edge stitches are getting a little bit too loosey-goosey, you want to give them what I call the wiggle and tug. You tug your working yarn and you wiggle your needle to tighten up the stitch on your needle, but preferably it's the stitch below your needle that you are actually snugging up a little bit. So that's how you're going to tighten up that side. Now be sure you don't tighten it up too much, otherwise your side is going to start to get like rouged. You know, it's going to pinch up on you. But that is how you can start to make sure that your edges are nice and neat. I'm just going to keep on knitting here. As you guys are working along, I want to tell you, congratulations, you are knitting. It might not be pretty, but you're doing it. Hey, look at you. Awesome. You guys are doing great. All right, anything else, Lillian?
Yeah, we have a few people asking here about which hand they should hold the yarn in. A couple of people prefer to hold it in their left hand in a continental style. So I'm wondering if you could maybe just tell us what that is.
Sure. All right. So what I've been teaching you guys is called English style. Okay. And that's, or throwing. And that's where you hold the yarn in your right hand to wrap your right hand needle. Some of you are probably familiar what's called continental, or it's also called picking. And that's where you hold your yarn in your left hand. Everything is exactly the same. I'm just holding my yarn in my opposite hand. So watch, I'm still going into the front door. I'm still going around my needle. See, I'm still going the long way around my needle. I'm still coming out the stitch and I'm still jumping off the porch, right? In the front door, around the corner, out the window, off the porch. Everything as far as the function of knitting is the same. I'm just holding my yarn in my other hand. This is actually one of those ways that a lot of crocheters like to do it, because we tend to hold our yarn like this when we crochet anyways. So it becomes a very natural movement. And you can do a wiggle and tug with the yarn in your left hand too. Like I can do, come in, do a wiggle and tug, tightens things up, and then move along. But this here, so I'm knitting just like I taught you guys. I'm just holding my yarn in the other hand. And honestly, this is how I knit. So if you were to come across other YouTube videos and you see people holding their yarn over here, they're not doing anything different as far as knitting. They're just holding their yarn in the other hand. But it's the same thing. It's the exact same thing that you guys are learning. All right, you see that? All right, so somebody says, what if I slip a stitch? If you catch it right away, you can, slip it back. But otherwise, a slip stitch that you catch later on, that could be considered a drop stitch that you have a float with. So I can show you how to fix that. That's easy, because we're actually going to talk about what to do if you find a mistake and how to tink. So we're going to learn a couple of ways to fix knitting right now, okay? Because this is one of the things, as I mentioned before, guys, I think it's one of the things that a lot of teachers do a disservice for knitters as beginners, is to not teach you a couple of things. First off is how to read your knitting. The second is how to fix some common mistakes so that way you don't get super flustered, okay? So let's go through here a little bit. So I'm gonna knit a couple stitches. And I want you to really think about the process that we're doing. We're going into this stitch, we're going around, and we're pulling a loop through and coming off. So we're creating essentially a grid, right? We have like A's and B's and 1s and 2s. We're essentially creating this one big grid. So if I wanted to unknit something, or say fix a mistake, let's say I made a mistake back here and I wanted to get back to this stitch. What I essentially need to do is hit rewind. So if we created this stitch by going into that stitch underneath it, what if we put that stitch underneath it back on our left-hand needle and let this stitch drop off? That would help us unknit, or tink, which is knit spelled backwards. So think of the stitch on your needle as the daughter. Think of the stitch underneath right here. That's the mother. So this is the daughter. This is the mother. We want to put the mother back on the left-hand needle because that's where it was, right? That's the one we let jump off. So what I do is I tend to pull my yarn apart and pull the fabric down so that way I can really stretch out the mother so I can see it. Take my left-hand needle and just stick it right into the mother. Just stick it right in. Now that mother stitch is back on my left-hand needle. So I could take my right-hand needle, let it come off of that yarn that was the daughter, and it just undoes itself. So now that stitch is back on the needle and my yarn is attached over here to this stitch now. So I just unknit. So we're going to try it again. I'm going to take the left-hand needle. I'm going to stick it into the mother of that stitch. And then I let the daughter fall off, give it a tug, and there we go. Stick it into the mother, let that stitch fall off, give it a tug, You'll have to readjust your tension because obviously you're getting more and more yarn over here. And you can do this all the way back to the beginning. And you could do this over several rows if you make a mistake far down. Now this one's a little bit tricky because you're at the edge. So at the edge, you kind of have to, look for where the mother is and just stab into it. Let the daughter fall off and you're good. So let's say I wanted to go back another row. Well, if I were finished knitting, I'd put it in my left hand, right? But if I want to unknit, I'm going to put it in my right hand. Spread this apart. Go into the mother, let the daughter fall off. Go into the mother, let the daughter fall off. In the mother, daughter fall off. And I do this until I get back to where I want it to be. It's like if you made a mistake and this is the only way you know how to fix it is to unknit, this is super convenient, right? We're just going to go into those mother stitches and we just keep pulling them off until we get to, let's say that was where our mistake was. We fixed it, we did whatever, and then we just carry on. Does that make sense? Okay. If you were to slip a stitch, so I'm going to slip this one and I'm going to knit. So let's just pretend I went into this and I forgot to wrap my yarn around and go on. So I just went into it and I slipped it off and I didn't catch it. I just kept on knitting. So I'm going to just keep on knitting here. I'll hold my yarn in my other hand so you guys can see there. Let's pretend that we didn't see it. We're going along and we're going to catch it on the way back. I'm going to turn my work. Oh, I keep wanting to put the yarn in my left hand now. So I'm just going to knit along. And what will happen is it will look a little bit different. First off, it's going to look like it has a string in front of it. You're going to be like, what is that? And that string is actually it's a float. It's the string that was supposed to be into the stitch, but you floated it behind the stitch instead because you slipped it, like right there. You see, looks like there's a string right there. You're like, what happened? What did I do? I don't know what I did. Well, that string is supposed to be through that loop to create a stitch. Okay. So what I'm going to do, because I know that that stitch is supposed to be knit because we're knitting, right? So here's what I would do. I would turn my work so that I'm looking at this stitch right here. This is the one I slipped and there's my loop, right? There's my loop. What I'm going to do, and this is going to be very similar to a bind off, which you guys are going to learn. I'm going to take my right hand needle. I'm going to go from front to back and I'm going to scoop up that loop. And I'm going to take my left hand needle. I'm going to grab the stitch that I slipped and have it jump up and over that bar that I just scooped up. Okay. When I do that, I want to make sure. So right now, see how it looks like the stitch is sitting where the back leg is forward. So I just want to make sure I switch that around. If you don't want to have to do that switcheroo, what you can do, I'm going to undo this again. If you don't want to do that switcheroo thing, what you could do is you could scoop up from the back and scoop up coming towards you. Can you see that? And then have the stitch jump up and over. And now the stitch lays on there correctly. You don't have to do any sort of switch. So you fixed it. We turn our work back to the side we're on. And if you forget what side you're on, remember that the side you're on, your yarn should be attached to the needle that's in your right hand. Okay. Now you look there, there's no more bar. The stitch is good and you're ready to go. So you just fixed a slip stitch. So now we're going to learn two more things. I'm going to show you what to do if you came across a knot in your knitting, or if you wanted to change colors, or if you wanted to add a new ball of yarn. And we're also going to talk about what to do if you had to put your work down and pick it up mid-row. Okay. So first things first, if you come across a knot in your knitting, like maybe it's a knot that came with the factory or whatever, there's a knot here. Let me grab my scissors. So we have a knot, we're going along, there's a knot, and we're like, oh man, there's a knot. What am I gonna do? Do I just knit over top of it? What am I gonna do? All right, so first things first, you do not want a knot in your knitting. If this is a sweater or a hat or a scarf or anything like that, that knot is going to rub against your skin. It's gonna pop out to the right side, or it's a knot that's gonna come undone later on and you're gonna get a hole in your knitting. So we don't want a knot in our knitting. So if you come across a knot, and this is the same in crochet, cut the yarn and preferably cut it when you're at the end of a row. So that way you can join your yarn at the end of the row. I'm going to grab this is not the same weight yarn, so it's going to look different, but let's just grab this. Let's pretend we cut it and then we're going to rejoin it. Why am I taking the time to do that? Just cut that. So we cut, you would take your yarn and you would rejoin it and you would start knitting with the same color. The same process is done if you wanted to change colors, okay? Same process is done if maybe this was the end of your first ball and you needed to end, you start a second ball. All of this is the same, all right? So why not change colors so you can see the process here? Now, I like to do this. I just told you not to put a knot in your knitting, right? The first thing I'm going to tell you to do is tie on your new color to your old color. You do not have to do this. I like to do it because it holds the two colors together and it just makes them easier to work with, in my opinion. When I go back to tie in my ends, I undo that knot, but I put it in there to start off with because it makes it easier. Once your yarn is tied on, you guys, you literally just start knitting with that yarn. This is how easy this is. You just start knitting with the new yarn. And that's it. Just start knitting with the new yarn. Now, let's say you get a phone call or your dog is getting into your chocolate bars or your kids are all of a sudden super quiet and you have to just be like, oh my gosh, I gotta go. I gotta go, right? You just throw your knitting down and you come back, you're like, oh, okay, what am I gonna do? All right, man, I don't know where I am. All right, I'm just gonna start knitting here. And you're like, oh, that looks funny. I don't know what I've done. Oh yeah, Marley said to put my yarn in back. Okay, I'm gonna put my yarn in back. All right, and then I'm just gonna start knitting. So the thing here is because we have two colors, we already know that, oops, we went backwards. We're not doing this right? We're just like, what? And then you stop and you're just like, what? Wait a second. Why are there gray over here? There's no gray over here. And you're like, I have a hole. And then it dawns on you, oh man, I picked up my work and I went backwards, right? You're just like, oh, okay, well, what do I do? Well, you have to unknit. So this is where you'll go into that mother, drop the daughter, into the mother, drop the daughter, into the mother, drop the daughter, into the mother, drop the daughter. Now you're at this point and you're like, okay, so what do I do? Oh yeah, that's right. Marley said, when you pick up your knitting mid-row, the yarn is going to be coming off of the needle that's in your right hand. So if you have to throw your work down mid-row for some reason and come back to it, when you pick it up, make sure that the yarn you're working with is coming off of the needle in your right hand. Does that make sense to everybody? Just by doing that, that will save you a ton, because if you were to do what I did before, where I just turned and came back and then we came all the way back, you would have a hole in your work right here. And there is no way to fix that other than ripping out. So just always being sure that when you pick it up and the yarn is coming off the needle in your right hand. That will help you a ton. Best thing yet though is, you guys, don't throw down your work mid-row. Just finish your whole row and it just makes things so much easier. Just two more things I want to show you, and then I'm going to let you guys go. I'm going to get to the end of the row here and we're going to talk about the fabric we've created. Actually, no, we're going to get to the end of the row and we're going to learn how to bind off. And then we're going to talk about the fabric we've created so you understand what it's called and what to look for as you're looking at future patterns. When your piece is as big as you want it to be, you cannot simply just take your needles out of your work. Otherwise, it's just going to fall apart. right? We have to bind off these stitches. So what we're going to do is we're going to knit 2 stitches and have the back stitch jump up and over the front stitch. And then knit 1 more stitch. So we have 2 stitches, have the back stitch jump over the front stitch. If you are a crocheter, we're essentially going to slip stitch down the row. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to start off by knitting 2 stitches. So knit 1, knit 2, and we're going to use our left hand needle to grab that back stitch and have it leapfrog up and over that front stitch and come off. When you do this, again, don't pull this string really tight. Keep that nice and comfortable. And then you go and you knit 1 more stitch that you can get to 2 over here. Have the back jump up and over the front. Knit 1. Have the back jump up and over the front. Knit 1. Have the back jump up and over the front. Knit 1. So on and so forth. Okay, guys? When we get to the end here, we're just going to cut our yarn, and then you can weave in your ends and everything's going to be good. Now, I know I have showed you a lot of stuff here in this hour, and some of you are like, I'm still back at the Slipknot. I want you to know that is 100% okay. If anybody says something to you, if they're like, hey, I thought you learned to knit today, it doesn't look like you got far. First off, you tell them you don't need that kind of negativity in your life. Second off, you tell them Marley said that you're doing just fine. All right. That's all you need to tell them. Marley said I'm doing just fine. If you need any extra help, I'm actually doing a Buy Crafty boot camp right now, teaching crocheters how to knit. But even if you're not a crocheter, you can still benefit from the knitting lessons. So there's lots of help out there for you. So don't fret. It's okay. Sometimes it takes people a month to get it, but that's fine. It will be good. I got to the end. I have 1 stitch left. I cut my yarn. Simply pull that stitch, just extend, give it a tug. And now all your stitches are bound off. Okay, now here's the deal. Right here, you have a bunch of bumps going on here. These are called garter ridges. If you separate this fabric out, what you will notice is you have 1 row where it looks like you have the nice knit V's and 1 row where you have these purl bumps. And why is that, you guys? That's because we turned our work back and forth and we knit each side. So at one point in time, one side we were looking at our heads, the other side we're looking at our pearls or our tails. And so we get what are called garter ridges. So this fabric here, this sort of bumpy fabric, even though you're knitting the whole time, this is called garter stitch. This is called garter stitch, okay? You're probably familiar with the whole concept of stockinette stitch, where it's all, you get this nice smooth fabric, and on the back side, it looks like bumps. This is created when you knit a row and then you purl a row. That's how you can get this type of fabric working back and forth, okay? So if somebody wants to ask you what you learned today, you can say, hey, I learned how to do the garter stitch. And the garter stitch, you guys, will take you through so many different patterns. You can create shawls, blankets, hats, mittens, gloves, scarves, cowls, sweaters, socks, underwear, shorts, blankets, pillows. I mean, anything you want, you can use garter stitch for. So go ahead and go back to my face, please. I want to tell all of you, congratulations, you are a knitter. It might not be a pretty knitter, but you're a knitter, right? Okay. So all of you can go ahead, go out, get yourself some ice cream. Again, tell them Marley said you could, totally fine. And when you are continuing on with your knitting, you must practice. Practice is going to help you with that muscle memory. And as you're going on, make sure you're sharing with us on social media. Like, hey, Marley, look what I've done. Or, hey, I did a wiggle and tug and my ends are so nice. Or look, I found a knot and I joined a new ball of yarn. Like, this stuff is exciting. And other people in your life might not get excited about it, but I guarantee you I will. So make sure you share with me, use hashtag MarleyBird, and I will make sure that I'm smashing your like button. Yarnspirations love seeing your work. They love to know that what we're teaching you is well received. So make sure you're sharing with them. This is great. Don't forget, this class is also recorded, so you can go back and watch it. I have other classes I've done with Michaels, and then of course there's the Buy Crafty Bootcamp with Marley Bird. Just Google it, you'll find it. There's all sorts of resources out there for you guys. So I just want you to know I'm not leaving you hanging, but you are officially a knitter because you can cast on, you can knit, you can fix more mistakes probably than a lot of advanced knitters can do. A lot of them don't even know how to fix little mistakes, and you can bind off. You guys are great. You're doing fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to hand it over to Lillian. And that's it for me, y'all.
Thanks, Marley. That was a wonderful class. And thanks for joining us today, everyone, for this live community classroom with Michaels. And don't forget, you can share your work with hashtag MakeUpWithMichaels and hashtag Yarnspirations. And just a reminder that you can find more classes on michaels.com and the recording of today's class at michaels.com/classes. Thanks so much, everyone. And thanks again, Marley.
You're welcome. Keep practicing, everybody.